Thank you. So the next speaker is Cliff Quank. Cliff is author of an upcoming book around titled User Friendly, around the kind of like a retrospective on the role of interaction designers. He was head of product at Fast Company, author and editor of thousands of articles around design and interaction design. And yeah, thank you.
Thanks. Hopefully this is working okay. Thank you for the introduction. As mentioned, I used to be the head of product at Fast Company. Before that, I was the founder of a site that some of you guys may know, called Fast Company Design. And for the last 5 years, I've been working on a book about the history of the idea of user friendliness. Where that's taken me in the last year is thinking, I think, more and more deeply about how interaction design relates to AI and how it relates to anticipatory interfaces that we're seeing more and more of today. So I'll just start by rolling the tape back a little bit. In the beginning, there was interaction design. We focused on making things predictable, right? This has been the mode of the last 40 years or so of interaction design, which is like making a screen that doesn't have to change even if the software can be updated, right? These things are fairly static, predictable. They work off of cognitive principles that relate to the most basic ways that we actually process information, right? But I think in the last 4 or 5 years, a lot of you, if you're UX trained, you probably went to school in an era in which you were like things like modeling, things like consistency, things like affordances were drilled into your head. They were beaten into your mind. I personally never thought that I'd see the day when a lot of those things started to disappear, and yet they are, right? So right now, if you look at a mobile game, for example, there are no affordances on that screen. There's the assumption that you discover what that interface is and how it works, right? But it's not necessarily laid out for you in a way that classical interaction design would have done so. Conversational interfaces, another layer of complexity in which the affordances, the affordances are not there anymore, and the mental model of what that thing does is no longer stable, right? Because it's changing all the time, because its capabilities are being augmented and updated by the cloud, and because a lot of the modeling itself is changing, right? So the point is that affordances, where they used to live in the interface, now increasingly live in our head, right? There are the assumptions you make about how things work. They are the expectations you bring to what a computer should be able to do. And therefore, like, the surface of design is changing now. And so I would say design now lives in our expectations, our assumptions, our biases about interfaces, right? And that in turn is the new material of design. What we're talking about is less expectations about how things perform, let's say physically, where you might have talked about the animation metaphors that underlie an interface. You're talking much more about vaguer notions about what people aspire to, what they assume something will be able to do, and things that are much harder to map these days. And so around that insight, I want to introduce to you I'm sorry, hopefully the resolution's showing up, but what I wanted to introduce to you to is a simple framework for thinking about how to design for assistive and AI systems that I think, and the reason I sort of thought about this framework is that I think we're mashing together a lot of different ways AI can help us and a lot of different ways that AI can work as an interface right now. And what this is showing is there's this fear of human conception, this fear of how humans view themselves and what they can do. And there's this fear of human capability, which is the things that they're good at and the things that they're capable of doing. These things don't overlap, right? As we all know, looking at users and looking at what users do, humans often overestimate what they can do, and sometimes they underestimate it as well, right? Sometimes these things overlap, but they're not necessarily perfect overlaps, right? So what I want to talk about is basically each section of this Venn diagram, right? So let's talk about problem one. I call it the meh problem. And this relates to the leftmost the leftmost section on this Venn diagram, right? This is where human capability exceeds human self-conception about what you do, right? So this is a section where you're basically talking about, well, actually, I think I switched this. Yeah, so this is human capability exceeding human self-conception. These are the things that you take for granted every day. These are the things you don't assume, that you don't even think about, because they're so embedded in, you know, your typical way of doing things. And this is actually the work. I'm not going to talk a ton about this sphere, because this is what we familiarly know is the work of AI and AI design right now. This is offloading the work that we would rather not be doing for ourselves, right? And in this case, actually, some classical interaction design principles hold, right? Things need to be reliable, accountable, reversible, transparent. I think I would argue right now that the dialogue is a little bit frozen right now on these specific problems, but as I'll get to in a second, I think we're moving beyond that, and we're moving to more complicated problems relating to those other spheres. So let's get into problem 2. I call this the duh problem. This is where human self-conception actually exceeds human capability. These are things where you think that you're better than you actually are at doing something, right? And this is something that has not been talked about a ton with related to interaction design and AI, because these are things where a machine makes a suggestion and you're just like, so what? Like, that was stupid. Like, I didn't need a suggestion for that. But that actually suggests a different mode of having to design for that interaction, right? And so we're going to get into some examples. These are obviously augmented capabilities that we put too much stock in, right? Sorry for the alarm. I thought I cleared that out. So an example that I would give you guys is IBM Watson, right? IBM Watson has been a troubled product, I think, in a lot of ways for various different reasons. But one reason that I actually want to talk about is actually less publicized, and it's a super interesting one. It specifically relates to IBM Watson Cancer, which in some ways is their I guess, keystone product, the one that they've actually had the most success in creating robust data sets and have productized the first, right? So the way the product works is basically you enter in diagnosis data if you're an oncologist, right? So it's much like a database interface, pretty simple, pretty well-trod path for interaction design. And then you get treatment options, right? These are presented in bands for you. I couldn't present a screenshot here, unfortunately. They're presented in bands for you that are basically related to confidence levels, right? The top one is basically like, you know, the most likely course of treatment and the most likely diagnosis given the information that you had entered, right? I went and actually watched for a while a team of UX researchers watching somebody use this product in the wild and being introduced to it for the first time. And one of the most interesting things that I heard, it was this duh problem, right? It's like, so the doctor had gone through the problem of entering all this data in, and it essentially had been presented with something that they thought was no added value, right? This was something that was not that interesting because the doctor was like, this is familiar, right? And so given this thing that could actually scrape tens of thousands of journal articles from the best journals in the world and collapse that understanding into 3 clear, concise recommendations, right? This is an incredibly powerful thing to be doing. The doctor was like, so what? Like, so what? Even though that doctor could never in their lifetime read all those journals, it was presenting them more information that they could possibly gather on their own. But the doctor, when presented with that information, said, this, you know, being a doctor is like an art, right? This is just the recipe. I don't need this, right? And so that's a super interesting place to be, in which the doctor actually doesn't recognize the power of the system and the capabilities that it affords, right? So it presented this problem, which went unsaid in the room, in which the IBM, I could tell, was super embarrassed that I saw in real time, which is, why would somebody ever use something that was just to help me? They wouldn't, right? Excuse me, I'm getting over a cold. So the question is, how do you actually show that AI is adding value, right? So you might think like you do things like progressive disclosure, evolving interfaces, discovered capabilities, right? This is like that would be your pretty standard strategy, right? Taking somebody along for the ride, basically, showing them your homework, showing how you arrived at an answer, and involving them at the arrival to that answer, right? But I would say this uncovers a different problem, right? This is a case in which the interface, as designed, was focusing on the rule rather than the exception, right? This is a case where it may have been more interesting to reverse the paradigm of what interaction design typically does and instead focus on the exception, right? So you can imagine an interface that would have instead only notified you when something was out of the ordinary, when something did not fit your mental model of how something should work, right? And that would be a completely different type of interface, right? And so you might move from a different scenario, right? So instead of going from entering diagnosis data to getting treatment options, you might instead move from something that was passively collecting diagnosis data and then showing useful exceptions, right? But you may have noticed in switching this paradigm, we now have a completely different problem that interaction design has had up to date, right? Because it's not about entering in information actively, it's about collecting information passively, right? That's an entirely different problem that comes with it, a sociological setting, psychological setting, and all kinds of different issues about how you gather information and how you gather information passively, right? So that the doctor, because I guess what I'm backing up, what I'm saying is that no doctor would ever go through the process of sitting for 30 minutes to enter in data on the off chance they might get an exception, right? So that actually has to be a passive interface, right? And that's a completely different way of thinking about how to build interfaces altogether. So that's one problem that comes up when you deal with that different part of that Venn diagram that I showed you. It's this question of how do you capture information invisibly in a way that actually doesn't put any burden on the user. Now, moving on, problem 3, I think is probably more familiarly known as like the killer robots problem, right? So this is basically where the human being says, I can do something, and in fact their capability lines up with the fact that they can do something, and so they think like, I'm going to be replaced, I'm going to be threatened by this interface, this is doing something that I should do myself but it's not letting me do, right? And this is like a different problem entirely as well. So this relates to helping us when we don't know that we need it, right? This relates to interfaces that are trying to help you when you think that you have solved a problem but you may not have, right? And so I want to give you an example of an interface that was developed it's still being developed at Carnegie Mellon by a group there that's actually looked at how do you develop a interface that would help doctors make decisions about when to insert an artificial heart, right? And what's interesting when you talk about decision systems for doctors is that, you know, we see all this kind of promise, we see all this kind of like hype being told about what AI can do and the concept in helping doctors make decisions. The thing that belies is there's probably about 30 years of academic research showing that every single decision assistive system for doctors has failed. They fail all the time. We do not know how to build these interfaces at all. We still don't know, how do you get a doctor to accept a recommendation or assistance from a machine? And part of that is like physical, right? It's very hard to actually have login systems in hospitals in which not just one person accesses a piece of data, right? That's an entirely hard UX problem. There's physical problems relating to doctors just can't use touch screens. But putting those aside, there's actually something deeper at work here. When that team at Carnegie Mellon actually looked at heart surgeons and why they might not use such interfaces, the things that they uncovered was this had to do with ego, it had to do with hierarchy, and it had to do with self-perception, right? So doctors by their nature thought, I am the exception. Nobody's going to tell me because I am a high performer that does not need to be told the basics, right? So automatically a huge hill to climb if you are an interaction designer. The second thing was hierarchy, right? Doctors often, they work in very regimented places where if you're a nurse, if you are a physician's assistant, to say, hey, doctor, I think you missed something, that is insane, right? You can get fired for that very easily, at least in the US, right? The way that hierarchy works, it just doesn't allow for that sort of thing, right? So an interesting thing that they discovered, though, is there's this quirk in the way doctors present highly difficult cases, which is a conference board, right? So doctors get together and they basically go over their toughest cases and they ask other doctors for advice about how to do that. And what they realized is the person that is the most overlooked there, that has the most power there, is the person that puts together the slides for the doctors, right? It's the person who nobody appreciates that has to get all this data and put it on a slide that doctors then all have to look at. They're all looking at the same information. And what they realize is we can slip in some AI into a PowerPoint program, right? You might have thought that like there was some great solution having to do with some great interface in the OR about making decisions about whether or not you should implant a heart, but instead they went to PowerPoint and they said like we can slip in this like completely non-threatening graph that some nurse can just say like, oh, this is just what the machine spat out. I'm not taking you on. I'm not trying to question your expertise. This is just what it did, right? So as this team is actually going forward, the interesting thing is they're discovering different strategies, right? Their next phase of work is actually having to do with trying to almost trick doctors into thinking that the recommendations of the machine are their own, right? So you would, in this case, you would actually have like a Potemkin AI model in which the doctor supposedly trains the AI about what the right recommendation is, but it's not really training it. I mean, a doctor is going to give it a couple hundred data points, whereas this machine can take in 35,000 from incredibly difficult cases. So it's really like what you're actually talking about is the Ikea effect, right? This is, if you don't know, this guy before was Richard Thaler, the famous behavioral economist. This is not what the research. I'm adding a little bit of interpretation on here, but what the researchers are discovering, this is the Ikea effect. For those of you who don't know, this is a study done by behavioral economists that show that human beings, when asked to co-craft something, value it more. So the study showed that basically after assembling an Ikea chair, people valued it economically higher than from before or another chair that somebody else had made, right? So these are instances where, again, going back to the introduction to my talk, these are situations where the biases, the psychological quirks of our minds are actually the fodder for design and design thinking, right? And so in this case, you might think like co-creation, understanding context, deference, example-based learning. These are just some of the quirks about psychology, about how we learn. But if you might have noticed, these are the ways humans have always used to build trust, right? These are the ways that you've always, if you think about how you get to know somebody and how you actually create a relationship with them, you do something together. You like have this trade-off of information. You have this shared space of understanding, right? And the point that I want to leave you guys with is that we'll get to the next phase by watching people in new ways, right? Too often, I think UX research is focused on end users actually using a baked product. Whereas where I think we're going is finding new ways to look at analogies that we can learn from, instructive ways in which the ways people talk to each other, the way they structure their social interaction can then change the way we design products, right? So, and interestingly enough, Microsoft got to this same point with their own AI principles, which closely mirror the principles that I laid out before. But the way they got there was not by, you know, like some interaction design framework that they dug out from some, you know, paper, like, you know, presented at Chai or something. the way they got there was watching actual real assistants and how they developed a relationship with their clients, right? Real personal assistants, how they developed trust over time with their clients. And what they did is try to abstract the principles for how personal assistants with low capability up front try to garner trust over time, right? So the point is, we're no longer watching the basics of information processes and how human minds process information and all those things that got remapped to things like models and consistency in interfaces. Rather, the structure of our relationships is now the fodder of design. And this is what we need to be understanding. And this is what we need to be watching as interaction designers, as UX designers, as engineers, thinking about how do you trust a system. And that's it. Thank you.
I think we've got time for a couple of questions for Cliff. Oh, one over there.
Hi. I'm a PhD student, but in a previous life, I worked at a cancer hospital. And I was just wondering, when you're talking about decision assistance systems failing, are you considering external ones or like in-house ones? Because we had quite a successful one. And I think part of the problem isn't just that they don't trust it, it's that it doesn't do what they need it to do.
Yeah, and I think that actually the greater problem in a lot of the peer-reviewed literature has to do more with the fact that a lot of times when somebody comes in outside to build a system for other people, they don't have UX people at the fore. They don't have any sort of user research at the fore. Typically, like, I mean, the sad thing is with medical systems is that it's a little bit of a backwater in terms of like current thinking about how to build software, right? And that's really the point there, is that very rarely do you assemble the right people to identify what the real problem is and what the actual context for use is. So things that we take it for granted in software development today actually don't happen in a lot of parts of the world.
Hi, so if we research people and their relationships, are we limiting ourselves to just what we know today in human forms, right? So can we, are there, I mean, it's a bit rhetorical, but like, are there things to learn from human robot relationships, because we're going to find new ways?
I would say as fast as things are speeding up right now, we have a couple, like 100 million years of evolution to catch up on that has actually done a very good job and a very difficult job of figuring out how our brains, which run at like, you know, the wattage less than a light bulb, can actually take in all these like complicated pieces of information and signals and actually structure them in a way that doesn't offend you and it doesn't offend me, and allows us to create some common space where we agree that we're having a conversation, we're following each other's, like, these are incredibly difficult things that I would argue we are so, at least as interaction designers, at least as UX designers, we are well behind the curve of understanding what that is and how that works.
Great talk. I did UX design for about 15 years, and when you started your talk talking about conversational agents, bots, my first reaction regularly when I talk to people who try to design those and user test with them, most of them suck. I mean, they're really
Terrible.
bad. Yeah. So I kind of feel like part of our job as UX designers might be to say, you're on a hype bandwagon with trying to build a bot for your product, and then we have to kind of educate the company, the product managers, the technologists about how hard it is to get that right, and that it might be a cheaper, easier, better UX experience to not go that way.
And that's why I think that like a lot of like the bot, like that stuff has gone away and it's been replaced with these hybrid interfaces that are a little bit of UI inside of a bot, right? I also work as a UX and a product consultant. I was just on a project where the team was hell-bent on suggesting a chatbot as a universal interface. And I just wanted to throw up. Like, I just could not get my head around it. And I was just like, this is never going to work. But the thing is like, people just have to go through this learning curve, right? We're going through, and it's a real disservice right now that I think a lot of the tech companies are actually pushing, they're actually part of the problem in thinking that these solutions, and here, you know, I would not necessarily exempt, like, I know that I'm here on Google's dime, but I wouldn't exempt Google from that either, right? We're still struggling with how you create, like a mental model for what something does when you have no interface that's that's graphical. And I don't know what the, like, I don't think like Google's not alone in that. Like, I don't know what the solution to that is. We're still figuring it out. It's going to take like 2 decades of negotiation about what machines do in order for us to get that right.
Hi. Oh, can you hear me? Yeah. Hi. My name's Alana. I'm from the DeepMind Health team. I was curious, do you know what the team model was for the Watson team? Like, did they involve UXR
Absolutely.
later on, like just to test?
No, they involved it up front very early. But here the point I wanted to bring out with that is there are blind spots in the way we assume, like, they're just like, there's almost like, you know, when the CIA actually does analysis, they actually have 2 teams working in like separate walls, going at a problem, hoping that they will come to different solutions. And the idea is that if they converge, you've got something, right? That's how the CIA does analysis. I don't think right now UX doesn't do that, right? You don't have like adversarial UX teams basically saying, like, I'm going to fight you about what the solution is to this problem.
You haven't worked with us, so.
Fair enough. Fair enough. But like, my point is like, in a lot of ways, we don't know the assumptions that we're making, right? They assumed that they were going to build a pretty simple database interface, right? That's a perfectly fine assumption, right? That's a perfectly fine thing. And you would have assumed from user data as a person, like creating a monetizable piece of software, you would have thought, the more I can get somebody to use this software, the more valuable it is, right? So those types of assumptions, like, sometimes they have to be thrown out, and maybe it actually takes you going all the way down the path to actually realizing that it didn't work, but you have to be able to throw something out that you actually committed to up front.
Got time for one more?
Yeah, I have a question. What would you think about an Hippocratic oath for developers? Part of the reason that people trust their doctors is because they really feel like they have the best in mind for them. I would say that sort of relationship with technologists is becoming increasingly broken. So would such an oath help?
I would agree. And speaking in Europe, obviously the amount of skepticism about technology is actually, you guys have been much more aggressive about it with things like the GDPR. I would agree that there needs to be a Hippocratic oath. What I would say as a provocation is that what companies have been relying on right now heretofore is marketing and public sentiment to take the place of a Hippocratic oath. So how you actually get a Hippocratic oath to seem meaningful in the wake of the way public tech companies have been handling their, like, getting basically public buy-in is a hard problem. I have no idea how somebody would trust a Hippocratic oath coming from the same bodies that are governing themselves, right? It's going to be really hard. I don't know the mechanism that you create for that. I don't think it's a bad idea. I just think that there's context there, and there's a way that we got to here that you can't just like say that we're going to do this Hippocratic oath and then like it's just going to change things. And I haven't seen anybody make that case yet.
While we're just in the chat, I'm going to use the privilege of position of having a microphone and ask a question myself. I think that, could you speak a little bit? I think one of the things that's implied in some ways in what you're saying, and the answer to the last but one question about often the metrics that are used by people who make product decisions, designers or otherwise, maybe force some of the design decisions. Could you speak a little bit? You talked about this sort of change in perception around design frameworks. Have you thought at all about kind of like metrics, you know, daily active users, monthly active users are sort of the mantra, particularly, you know, in the Valley and amongst investors. How do you think that should change in this?
So I have this like evolving understanding. I think that this is kind of implied in the talk that I gave, but I think that we're moving up. If you think about Maslow's hierarchy, where we're fulfilling basic needs, and where, if you think about interaction design, in its early phases, having fulfilled like basic ideas and basic needs, those things were relatively easy to measure, right? were you able to do what you want, right? As UX designers, we figured out how to measure that pretty well. But I think that interfaces are now moving higher up Maslow's hierarchy in the sense that they're now faced with problems like, how do you trust something? Did I find this satisfying? Did this make me happier, right? Those are things that we don't have metrics yet. But I would say to you that, like, right now, we don't have a way to actually, for people to actually express that information in the interfaces that they deal with. An example that I would give you, for example, is that when you walk into a travel agent, a really good travel agent, or almost any like expensive high-end service, you can specify what kind of experience you want to have. You can say to a travel agent, like, I want a little bit of adventure, not too much. Mostly I want to like hang out on the beach, right? You can give that kind of like heuristic about what kind of experience you want to have. Right now, as a user of computer software, you cannot do that at all. I can't tell my phone, hey phone, I want to chill out today, right? Hey phone, keep me super plugged in because I've got a lot of really intense stuff and I want to make sure that I don't miss anything, right? We're not designing for any of that opt-in behavior that would give us that data to be able to measure any of those things. And so what I want to say is, like, there's probably a future for an interface that is about expressing high-level human desire as the almost the guidelines that a machine learning algorithm can fill in by providing some sort of usage pattern that fits with the high-level heuristics that you have offered as a user. And until we get to that point, I'm just not sure like how we're going to figure that stuff out. But I hope we do.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you, Cliff.
So I'm going to welcome Sarah. Sarah Gold is an expert in